Hi, so my name is Robert and I will be taking you through the process of making the game State Switch, which was my submission for the 8-Bit to Infinity game jam. So the first thing I needed was an idea, and I had the idea of a blob sort of character who can change states between solid, liquid and gas to solve puzzles, but you didn't actually have any real control over the character other than being able to change its state. I thought this would fit quite well with the theme, which was Switch. So you'd be switching between the different states of matter. The idea reminded me of a game I played when I was younger called Loco Roco, where you play as a sort of blob and you can split off into lots more littler blobs depending on the situation. Initially I thought I would have to code all of the forces between the different particles, but actually Unity has a point effector and it effectively will do this for me. All I had to do was create a list of variables that I would apply to the particles in the different states, and also apply a physics material to each of them depending on their state, as well as giving some player feedback like changing the color slightly or a different sound or something. So the point effector basically applies a force to anything that touches its colliders. So all I had to do was give a circle collider, because it's a 2D game, give a circle collider and set that to trigger around a radius that I want to be affected by state. So if, for example, it was a solid, I would have a large radius and have the force attractive so that all of the particles would be attracted to each other and create a sort of solid structure. And if it was a gas, obviously I wouldn't want them to be attracted in the same way, but maybe some, so that they maintain some sort of shape but float up and change the gravity scale on the object for when it's a gas. And a liquid, obviously we'd want it to run down, so we'd want it to have gravity but also not be too attractive and be frictionless, and etc. Yeah. So the player controls were very simple. It just came down to changing variables based on what button was pressed. So I just had 3 functions which would be triggered depending on what the player input was to change to that state. Really the only interesting coding was the switch mechanics. So by switch I mean a literal switch to turn something on. So there were multiple objects in the game that required electricity to run, and the way you would turn them on was by becoming a liquid that would flow between an anode and a cathode, and then the electricity would be passed between the particles and the switch would be turned on. So initially I wanted to create a chain system where a particle was in an electrode, it would be charged, and any particle near to it would then become charged continuously. So any particle within a certain range of a charged particle would then become charged. This was good for charging them, but the difficulty was, when does a particle lose its charge? What I ended up doing was, which is definitely not a foolproof system, but worked perfectly fine for this game jam and wasn't too computational, was to make all the particles lose their charge if there are no particles in the anode where they collect their charge in the first place. Otherwise they would spread their charge if another particle is within a given conductivity distance, and finally the switch is triggered if a particle with charge gets to the cathode. The only problem with this was it was initially breaking if there were multiple switches in a level. Fortunately this was a pretty simple fix, you just need to make it prioritize the closest switch. The only other interesting thing really game development wise with this game was the negative light effect that I used for the antimatter. So I gave the antimatter a 2D light object, and unfortunately in Unity in the inspector you cannot give something a negative light, but if you do it in script it works perfectly fine. So you just have to have a script on each of the lights saying once the game is started you just need to change the color of the light to be negative RGB values, and that creates this black light, so it will suck in all of the actual lit objects around it, which I think looks really good in the game. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So I ended up winning the jam, which was a nice bonus. And if you'd like to play the game, the link is below, or you can check out my website, gleevegames.github.io.